The nurse accidentally signed a marriage contract. Now she's a millionaire's legal wife. Before we begin, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and is the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's continue the story. The rain had just stopped over New York, leaving the hospital windows fogged with streaks of silver light. Inside the administrative office, the clock ticked softly, and a typewriter clattered somewhere down the hall. Evelyn Moore, a young nurse barely 26, stood at a counter stacked high with patient charts. Her hands were trembling from exhaustion. She had been on her feet for 12 hours straight. "Sign here, please," said the weary clerk without even looking up, sliding a thin stack of papers toward her. Evelyn did not notice that one page had a gold-embossed seal and a title she could not quite read through the smudge of carbon ink * marriage license authorization. Asterisk. She signed her name with a tired sigh, thinking it was another form for consent or treatment. The pen clicked, and fate quietly sealed itself in that single stroke. Moments later, an ambulance siren wailed outside, and the clerk rushed away. Evelyn gathered her coat and stepped into the quiet corridor, unaware that she had just become the legal wife of a man she had never met. Down the hall, room 307 glowed faintly behind frosted glass. Inside lay William Harrington, the reclusive millionaire who had been in a coma for 6 months after a car accident on the Hudson Bridge. His empire, Harrington Rail, was on the edge of collapse, his board desperate to protect what was left. The hospital's attorney had drawn up an emergency guardianship, and through a clerical mix-up, the signature meant for a proxy nurse had fallen under Evelyn's pen. By the time she reached the elevator, a storm was brewing again. She thought only about getting home, maybe sleeping a full night for once. But back in the boardroom of Harrington Rail, men in tailored suits stared at the notarized document in disbelief. "It's legal," said the lawyer, his voice low and certain. "William Harrington is now married to Miss Evelyn Moore." The news spread like fire through the mansion on Riverside Drive. The housekeeper polished the silver for a dinner that would never happen. The chauffeur whispered to the cook, and the old butler simply shook his head. That night, as the city lights flickered against the rain-soaked windows of her small apartment, Evelyn reheated a can of soup and rubbed her sore feet. She had no idea why her phone kept ringing with unfamiliar numbers. When she finally answered, a deep voice on the other end said, "Mrs. Harrington, the board requires your presence tomorrow at 10. She almost laughed. "You must have the wrong person." But the man replied firmly, "We have your signature, ma'am." At 10 the next morning, Evelyn stood in a mahogany conference room surrounded by men old enough to be her father. The air smelled of cigars and distrust. "You are by law, Mr. Harrington's wife," the attorney said. "Until the marriage is annulled, you represent his estate." Her breath caught. She felt every eye in the room judging her second-hand shoes and wrinkled uniform. The chandelier above her glittered like 1,000 silent witnesses. That evening, she was escorted to the Harrington mansion, a sprawling stone estate with marble floors, high ceilings, and portraits of men who looked as though they had never smiled in their lives. The butler bowed slightly and whispered, "Welcome home, Mrs. Harrington." Evelyn wanted to protest, to explain the mistake, but her words were swallowed by the grand silence of the place. Somewhere upstairs, behind a closed oak door, the man whose name she now carried lay unconscious, unaware that a stranger had become his wife. The house creaked like it was breathing, alive with secrets. Evelyn walked slowly through the hallway, her footsteps echoing on the black and white tiles. Her reflection caught in the gold-framed mirror, small, tired, and completely out of place. And as thunder rolled again over the Hudson, one thought circled in her mind like a haunting refrain. Asterisk. What if this mistake was never meant to be undone? Asterisk. Stay with me, because everything that happens next will change Evelyn's life forever. Now, let us return to our main character. The next morning, gray light filtered through the tall windows of the Harrington boardroom, glinting off polished brass fixtures and dark walnut walls. Evelyn Moore stood at the end of a long conference table surrounded by men in charcoal suits and sharp ties. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and she could feel the weight of every stare. The air was thick with disbelief and the faint smell of cigars. "Miss Moore," said Mr. Crane, the family attorney, in a tone that felt both polite and cold. By the signature on this document, you are now legally Mrs. William Harrington. Until the marriage is annulled, you are the acting guardian of his estate. The words echoed in her ears. Unreal, absurd. She stammered, "There has been a mistake." "I did not mean to blank," but the lawyer cut her off gently. "Intent is irrelevant, Mrs. Harrington. The law recognizes only the ink." The other men exchanged whispers, their eyes shifting between curiosity and disdain. One of them, a senior board member with silver hair, leaned forward. "Do you have any idea what being a Harrington means, young lady?" Evelyn wanted to disappear. She shook her head and murmured, "No, sir." He exhaled sharply through his nose. "Then I suggest you learn quickly." Papers were pushed toward her for review, but she barely heard the rest. All she could think of was the hospital, her patients, and the paycheck she would likely lose if she did not return by nightfall. When she finally stepped out into the crisp morning air, the city noise crashed against her like a wave. Cameras flashed from the corner across the street. Someone had leaked the story. "Nurse Mary's sleeping millionaire," shouted a newspaper boy holding up a fresh stack of headlines. Her face burned as strangers turned to look. She ducked into the nearest cab and told the driver her address, voice shaking. By the time she reached her small apartment, 2 reporters were already waiting by the door. She hurried inside and locked it behind her. The phone rang again and again until she unplugged it from the wall. That night, she sat on the edge of her narrow bed staring at the marriage license on her nightstand. The embossed gold seal shimmered under the weak light of the lamp. Her friend Lydia, another nurse from St. Agnes Hospital, came by after her shift with a loaf of bread and 2 cups of coffee. "You are all over the papers, Evie," Lydia said softly, handing her 1 cup. "Do you want to tell me what is going on?" Evelyn's voice cracked. "It was an accident. I just signed a form. They think I am his wife." Lydia frowned, but tried to smile. "Maybe it is a strange kind of miracle. You always said you wanted a sign from heaven." Evelyn laughed bitterly. Heaven must have a cruel sense of humor. Later that night, a black automobile stopped outside her building. A man in a bowler hat knocked on her door and handed her an envelope sealed with the Harrington crest. Inside was a formal summons. She was expected to move into the Harrington estate immediately for the integrity of the family name. The letter was signed by the board of directors. She looked up at Lydia, her pulse racing. "They cannot be serious," she whispered. But they were. The next evening, Evelyn stood before the towering iron gates of the mansion once again. Gas lanterns flickered on either side, their lights soft against the fog. The butler opened the grand doors and bowed slightly. "Good evening, Mrs. Harrington. The master's quarters are prepared." Inside, the marble foyer gleamed under the chandelier, its crystals reflecting 1,000 fractured lights. Servants moved quietly in the background, avoiding her eyes. A portrait of William Harrington hung above the fireplace, a man with stern gray eyes and the posture of someone who had never known failure. Evelyn's room was at the far end of the 2nd floor, overlooking a frozen rose garden. On the nightstand lay another envelope from the lawyer, this one outlining the contract terms. She must remain in residence for 3 months, appear at any public event requested, and refrain from discussing her position with the press. In return, she would receive a stipend and legal protection from the media storm. She folded the letter, feeling as though invisible chains had wrapped around her wrists. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 9. The house was silent except for the ticking of its pendulum. Evelyn walked through the hall, the sound of her heels faint against the marble. She paused by the half-open door of the master's suite. Inside, William Harrington lay motionless in his bed, machines humming softly around him. His chest rose and fell with shallow rhythm, his face pale but strong, the features of a man who had once commanded the world. Evelyn whispered, almost to herself, "You have no idea what I have gotten us into." Outside, the wind howled against the tall windows, rattling them in their frames. The nurse who never dreamed beyond her next paycheck was now trapped inside a palace of gold and silence. And as she stood there, watching the flicker of the lamp cast shadows across the floor, one thing became frighteningly clear: this was no longer a mistake she could walk away from. Stay with me. What happens next will test every ounce of Evelyn's courage as she faces the powerful world that now calls her Mrs. Harrington. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Harrington estate, revealing a home that looked more like a museum than a place to live. Every corner glimmered with silver and marble. Every step echoed like a whisper of the past. Evelyn Moore woke early, still not used to the silence that filled every hallway. The house seemed too large, too perfect, and entirely too empty. When she descended the curved staircase, the butler was already waiting in the foyer with a silver tray. "Good morning, Mrs. Harrington," he said with a practiced bow. On the tray was a folded letter sealed in wax. She hesitated before opening it. Inside, the lawyer's elegant handwriting outlined what he called the contract clauses. 3 months of residence, no public statements, attendance at all events, and above all, full cooperation with the board to maintain the illusion of a stable marriage until legal arrangements could be made. She sighed softly. It was not a marriage, it was a masquerade. At breakfast, she sat at one end of a dining table so long that the distance to the other chair felt like a chasm. A crystal chandelier sparkled above, casting reflections across the polished mahogany surface. The servants moved quietly, placing china plates and silver utensils before her. She picked at her food without appetite. The staff exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. "She is the nurse, is she not?" one of them murmured near the doorway. "I heard she married him for money." Evelyn lowered her fork, the sound of it striking porcelain loud in the stillness. She wanted to explain, to shout that it was not true, but the words never left her lips. Later that day, the family attorney, Mr. Crane, arrived to go over the estate's affairs. They met in the grand library, a cavernous room lined with dark oak shelves that reached the ceiling. Dust motes floated in the shafts of sunlight coming through tall drapes. "Mrs. Harrington," Mr. Crane began, his tone polite but distant, "as you are aware, your current position is temporary. The board will expect your discretion. The press has already begun spinning this situation into scandal." He placed a folder before her, filled with bank ledgers and legal forms. Evelyn looked up from the pages, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do they all think I did this on purpose?" The man hesitated before answering, "In this city, perception often matters more than truth." She nodded slowly, realizing that her word meant nothing in a world built on reputation. That evening, she visited the master's suite, as she had every night since moving in. The air in the room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender polish. Machines hummed softly beside the bed. William Harrington lay there, his skin pale but peaceful, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. The dim lamp cast warm light over his face, revealing the trace of a man who once controlled empires. Evelyn adjusted the blanket and whispered, "You do not know me, and I do not know you. Yet our lives are bound together by a mistake neither of us chose." Her voice trembled, but speaking aloud made the silence less heavy. Days passed in slow rhythm. She followed the housekeeper's schedule, read old newspapers in the library, and took her meals alone. But the more time she spent there, the more she noticed details that felt strangely human. A sketchbook left on the side table, filled with rough pencil drawings of train stations and bridges. A half-finished chess game frozen in time near the window. A photograph of William with his parents, smiling faintly in front of a steam locomotive. These small relics of his life softened something inside her. She began to wonder what kind of man he had been before the accident, ruthless, as the newspapers said, or lonely beneath the weight of success. One night, while a winter storm battered the windows, Evelyn sat by the fireplace in the library, reading a book she found on the shelf. It was titled The Law of Inheritance. She smiled bitterly at the irony. The flames crackled, throwing shadows across the walls. Somewhere above, the medical monitor from the master's room beeped in its steady rhythm, faint but constant, like a distant heartbeat reminding her of the connection she could not escape. She closed the book, her eyes drawn to the dancing firelight. 3 months, she murmured to herself. 3 months, and I can return to my real life. But even as she said it, she knew that life would never be the same. That night, she dreamed of ink on paper and a pen slipping from her tired hand, the black signature spreading like a web. When she woke, the first light of dawn was touching the windows, and for a moment, she thought she heard movement upstairs, soft, almost imperceptible. She told herself it was the wind, but part of her heart whispered something else. Something was changing in the Harrington house, something that would soon pull her far deeper than any contract ever could. The morning after the storm, the sky over Manhattan was a washed-out gray, and the air inside the Harrington mansion carried the faint scent of rain-soaked wood. Evelyn Moore walked down the corridor toward the master's room, a tray of fresh linens balanced carefully in her hands. She had developed a quiet routine: check the machines, adjust the blinds, speak softly to the man who would never answer. But that morning, something felt different. The monitor beside William Harrington's bed hummed steadily, yet the rhythm was faster than usual, like a drum waking from a long silence. Evelyn froze, eyes wide. His fingers moved just slightly, a tremor so faint it could have been imagined. "Mr. Harrington?" she whispered, setting the tray aside. His eyelids fluttered, and for the first time, the unbroken stillness of months cracked open. She ran to the phone and called for Dr. Howard, the physician who visited weekly to monitor William's condition. Within minutes, the house filled with footsteps, voices, and the sharp scent of alcohol and medicine. Evelyn stood near the window as doctors crowded around the bed. "Increase the oxygen flow," one ordered. "Prepare for neurological assessment," another said. Then, like a whisper through the chaos, came a sound Evelyn would never forget: his voice, dry and cracked, barely more than breath. "Where am I?" Every head turned. Evelyn gasped, her heart hammering. Dr. Howard leaned closer. "Mr. Harrington, can you hear me?" The man's gaze shifted slowly, unfocused, until it found Evelyn. For a second, his lips parted, as though he recognized her. But then the moment passed. "Who are you?" he asked weakly. Over the next few days, the house transformed into a small hospital. Specialists came and went, nurses arrived in rotating shifts, and reporters camped outside the iron gates. Evelyn kept to the shadows, quietly assisting Dr. Howard, even though she was no longer part of the hospital staff. She changed dressings, adjusted his blankets, and spoke softly to calm him when confusion gripped him. He recovered fragments of memory: his company, his name but not the accident, and certainly not the mysterious marriage. One afternoon, as pale winter light streamed through the tall windows, William sat upright for the first time, his frame lean and commanding even in weakness. Evelyn entered the room with a cup of tea, but he did not look at her. "You have been here every day," he said, voice low but steady. "Who are you, really?" Evelyn hesitated, unsure what the doctors had told him. "I am your nurse," she answered carefully. He studied her face for a long moment. "You do not look like someone hired by the hospital." The silence stretched. She wanted to tell him the truth, to explain everything, but fear sealed her lips. Before she could answer, Mr. Crane entered the room carrying a folder. "Mr. Harrington," he said formally, "there are some legal matters to review. It concerns your estate and your wife." William blinked, confusion flickering in his eyes. "My what?" Mr. Crane cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "There was an emergency guardianship arranged during your coma. It appears that due to a clerical error, a nurse, Miss Evelyn Moore, became, by law, Mrs. William Harrington." The room went silent. The ticking of the clock on the wall filled the space between them. William's gaze snapped to her, sharp and unreadable. "Is that true?" Evelyn's throat tightened. "Yes," she whispered. "But it was a mistake. I never meant—" He cut her off with a hoarse laugh that carried no warmth. "A mistake? I wake up from a coma and find myself married to a stranger, and you call it a mistake?" Mr. Crane tried to mediate, but William lifted a hand, silencing him. "Leave us," he said firmly. The lawyer hesitated, then exited, closing the door behind him. Evelyn stood still, the silence pressing against her chest. William turned toward her, his blue eyes like steel. "Tell me why I should believe anything you say," he murmured. "Every headline outside calls you an opportunist." She stepped forward, trembling. "Because I never wanted any of this. I wanted to help, not to take." For a long time, he said nothing. Then he leaned back against the pillows, his tone weary but edged with irony. "Well, Mrs. Harrington, it seems we are bound by paper and law. Until this mess is undone, we are husband and wife. Let us at least make it tolerable." That night, the house felt colder than ever. Evelyn sat in her room staring at the flicker of the fireplace. She had thought the hardest part was surviving the lie. She was wrong. The hardest part was living beside the man who made her heart race with guilt and something she could not name. Upstairs, in the master suite, William stared at the ceiling, the faint echo of her voice still in his mind. Neither of them slept. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath for what would come next. In the days that followed his awakening, the Harrington mansion became a house divided between silence and suspicion. William Harrington moved through its halls with the slow, deliberate steps of a man relearning the world. His cane clicked softly against the marble floors, the sound trailing him like an echo of authority trying to find its place again. Evelyn Moore, now living as his accidental wife, kept her distance. She rose early, helped the staff prepare his meals, and disappeared into the library or garden whenever he entered a room. But avoidance only made the tension thicker. On the 5th morning after his recovery, William found her in the sitting room arranging flowers into a porcelain vase. "You do not have to play the dutiful wife," he said quietly from the doorway. His voice startled her. The stem in her hand snapped. She turned, meeting his gaze. "I am not playing anything," she answered, her tone firmer than she expected. "I am trying to be respectful." William stepped forward, the light from the tall windows catching the sharp line of his jaw. "Respectful?" he repeated. "You walk around this house like a guest, yet half the city believes you own it. Do you even understand what you have done to my name?" Evelyn's lips parted, but no words came. He continued, his voice rising. "I built everything I have from the ground up, and now the papers call me a fool married to a scheming nurse." The words hit her like a slap. "I did not ask for this," she said, her voice trembling. "You think I wanted to be dragged into your world, accused of chasing fortune? I signed the wrong paper, and now everyone looks at me like a thief." For a long moment neither spoke. Then William exhaled sharply and looked away. "Perhaps I was unfair," he said quietly. "But in my world, appearances are everything. You will learn that soon enough." That evening, a blizzard swept across the city. The power flickered, and the mansion glowed only by candlelight. Evelyn carried a lantern through the hall, checking on the servants who were closing the shutters against the wind. In the library, she found William sitting near the fireplace, a decanter of brandy untouched beside him. The firelight carved golden lines across his face, softening the edges of his stern expression. "The generator will keep the essentials running," she said, setting the lantern down. He nodded absently, staring into the flames. After a moment, he spoke, his tone quieter than before. "I do not remember the accident," he said. "They tell me I drove off the Hudson Bridge. Strange, is it not? To lose your life for a year and wake up married to someone you never met." Evelyn hesitated, unsure whether to speak. "Maybe," she said softly, "it was not losing your life. Maybe it was getting a second chance." He looked up at her, his eyes sharp but no longer cold. "You believe that?" She gave a small nod. "I have to. Otherwise, everything feels meaningless." For the first time, he smiled, barely there, fleeting, but real. "You are an unusual woman, Mrs. Harrington." She smiled faintly back. "So they keep telling me." The silence between them stretched, not hostile this time, but fragile and uncertain, like the first step across a frozen lake. The following days brought a fragile peace. William began walking through the garden with Evelyn nearby, the cane tapping in rhythm with her footsteps. They spoke little, yet the air between them softened. One afternoon, she found him in the library reading through ledgers. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The meetings? The power?" He closed the book slowly. "I miss purpose," he admitted. "Before the accident, all I cared about was profit. Now I am not sure what I am fighting for." Evelyn nodded, understanding more than she could say. That night, as snow fell in thick, silent sheets, she passed by his room and saw him standing by the window, staring out into the white. Their eyes met briefly before she turned away. Neither spoke, yet something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of empathy, of understanding, of two people bound by mistake but beginning to see one another as something more than an error of fate. Still, the world outside the mansion was not so forgiving. The newspapers continued to print her name, twisting their story into scandal and gossip. And though William said nothing, Evelyn could sense the storm gathering behind his calm. The line between mistrust and tenderness was thinning, and both of them were about to discover how easily it could break. Winter loosened its grip on New York. But the chill inside the Harrington mansion lingered in the air, like an echo of everything unsaid. Weeks had passed since William Harrington awoke from his coma, and although his strength returned, something in him remained restless. He spent his mornings in the study surrounded by correspondence, letters of apology from business partners, and offers from the board to resume his position as chairman. But every time he reached for a pen, he stopped midway, his gaze drifting toward the garden where Evelyn Moore often walked in silence. One evening, as the grandfather clock struck 7, the butler appeared at Evelyn's door holding a folded note. "Mr. Harrington requests your presence in the music room," he said. Evelyn frowned slightly but followed. The mansion was dimly lit, candles flickering along the corridor. When she entered the room, she found William at the piano, pressing a few hesitant keys as though reacquainting himself with sound. "I did not know you played," she said softly. He glanced up, his expression unreadable. "I used to," he murmured, "before the world started spinning faster than I could keep up." He gestured to the seat beside him. "Sit. There is something we need to discuss." Evelyn sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. William studied her for a long moment. "I have been invited to the Carter Foundation Gala this weekend," he said. "It is the first public event I will attend since the accident. The board insists that I appear with my wife." Evelyn blinked. "Your wife?" He nodded. "You. The law still says you are." She swallowed hard. "I am not sure I belong in that kind of world, Mr. Harrington." His voice softened slightly. "Neither am I. But for one evening, we will remind them that we can endure their judgment." 2 nights later, the mansion stirred with preparation. Dresses were delivered from a designer in Manhattan, and the staff pressed suits, polished shoes, and whispered in the halls. Evelyn stood before the mirror in her borrowed gown, a soft champagne color that shimmered faintly under the chandelier. The reflection staring back at her barely looked like the nurse who once scrubbed hospital floors. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine walking into that glittering world not as an intruder, but as someone who belonged, if only for a night. When the car arrived, William waited at the foot of the staircase, impeccably dressed in a black tuxedo. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. The sight of her stopped him mid-thought. Evelyn caught his gaze, uneasy under the weight of it. "Do I look foolish?" she asked quietly. "You look," he began, pausing, "exactly how I imagined my wife would." She smiled nervously. "Let us hope the rest of New York agrees." The Carter Foundation Gala was held at the Grand Astoria Hotel, a ballroom filled with crystal chandeliers and the sound of a string orchestra. As they entered, heads turned, whispers spreading like ripples through water. "That is her, the nurse," someone murmured. "He brought her?" Evelyn's pulse quickened, but she kept her chin high. William, ever composed, offered his arm and said quietly, "Let them talk." During the dinner, a journalist approached with a sly smile. "Mr. Harrington, Mrs. Harrington, care to comment on your rather unconventional romance?" Evelyn felt heat rush to her cheeks, but before she could speak, William leaned forward, his voice calm and clear. "You may write whatever sells papers," he said evenly. "But if you truly wish to report something worth printing, write that kindness is not a weakness." The reporter's smile faltered, and the room seemed to hush. Evelyn looked at him, surprised by the quiet strength in his words. Later, as the orchestra played a slow waltz, William offered his hand. "We should give them something else to talk about," he said with a faint smirk. She hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. The dance began awkwardly, his steps uncertain, but soon they found a rhythm. The lights dimmed, the music swelled, and for a brief, perfect moment, the world outside their small circle disappeared. When the song ended, applause filled the room, not mocking, but sincere. That night, as the car rolled back toward the mansion, the city lights glimmered through the windows. Evelyn stared out, her heart still racing. William broke the silence. "You were extraordinary tonight," she smiled faintly. "You were not too terrible yourself." He chuckled softly, the first genuine laugh she had heard from him. The distance between them, so wide before, seemed to shrink to the width of a heartbeat, yet somewhere deep inside, both knew the peace would not last. The world had seen them together, and the world always demanded a price. The glow of the gala still lingered in Evelyn's mind the next morning, but by midday, the dream began to crumble. The headlines were everywhere, splashed across front pages and radio broadcasts. Asterisk, Millionaire, William Harrington reappears, with his nurse-turned-wife love or scandal. Asterisk. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. Servants whispered behind closed doors, reporters gathered at the estate gates, and William's phone rang endlessly. When he finally answered one call, his expression hardened. "Who told them?" he demanded. No one knew, but the betrayal had already spread like wildfire. That afternoon, the board of Harrington Rail held an emergency meeting at the downtown office. Evelyn was not invited, but word reached her through the household staff. One of the maids rushed to her in the corridor, eyes wide. "They are saying the marriage was planned, that you tricked him for inheritance." Evelyn froze, her chest tightening. Downstairs, the butler handed her a folded newspaper, her face printed beside William's. The caption cruel, Asterisk. From ward to wife. The rise of Evelyn Moore. Asterisk. Her fingers trembled. Who would do this? She whispered. The butler lowered his gaze. Sometimes the enemies we cannot see are the ones closest to us. By evening, William returned home, his jaw tense, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion. Evelyn waited in the study, hoping for reassurance, but he did not speak at first. He poured a drink instead, the ice clinking softly against glass. "The board believes you leaked the story," he said finally. She blinked, stunned. "Me? Why would I?" He turned toward her. "Because it benefits you, does it not? The public sympathy, the power of a headline." Her throat went dry. "You cannot believe that." He said nothing, but the silence between them was an answer. "I stood beside you when the world doubted you," she said, voice breaking. "And now you doubt me?" The storm outside mirrored the one within the mansion. Lightning flashed across the tall windows and thunder rolled over the city. William's voice rose above the wind. "You have to understand what is at stake. My company, my reputation, everything my father built." Evelyn stepped closer, tears burning her eyes. "And what about me? What about the truth?" But his anger drowned out her words. "The truth does not matter in my world," he snapped. She flinched, her face pale. For a long moment they stood there, two people separated not by distance but by pride. Later that night, she sat alone in the small parlor, the fire dying to embers. The house felt too large, too empty again. On the table lay the newspaper, its headline mocking her. The rain outside turned to sleet, tapping against the windows like cold fingers. She thought of the night she first arrived, lost and uncertain, and how for a brief moment she had felt safe. That illusion was gone now. Upstairs, she heard William's footsteps pacing the floor, then a door closing sharply. The sound echoed through the halls like a verdict. The following morning, Mr. Crane, the family attorney, arrived with a somber expression. He handed Evelyn an envelope sealed in red wax. "Harrington has requested that you sign these papers," he said. She unfolded them slowly, a legal separation agreement. Her vision blurred. "Is this his idea of protection?" she asked bitterly. The lawyer's tone was quiet. "He believes it will calm the press and stabilize the company." Evelyn's hands shook. "And what about what it does to me?" He had no answer. When William came downstairs, she was waiting in the foyer, dressed simply, her hair pulled back. "If this is what you want," she said, holding the papers, "then I will not fight you." He hesitated, something flickering behind his eyes. Regret, perhaps, but pride won. "It is for the best," he said. She nodded once, signing her name. The pen scratched across the paper like a blade through silk. "Goodbye, Mr. Harrington," she whispered, using the title deliberately. Then she handed him the papers and walked out into the cold morning rain without looking back. As the door closed behind her, William stood in the foyer, the echo of her footsteps fading into silence. The world outside would never know that the man they called ruthless had just let go of the only person who ever looked at him without fear. Upstairs, the fire in the study flickered out. The storm had passed, but the house felt colder than ever. And for the first time, William realized that in trying to protect everything he had built, he might have just destroyed the only thing that truly mattered. Weeks passed since Evelyn Moore left the Harrington mansion, and the city seemed to move on without her. The newspapers found new scandals. The world found new names to whisper about, but inside her small apartment above a flower shop on West 12th Street, time felt slower. She had taken a position at St. Anne's Clinic, tending to patients who could not afford hospital care. It was not glamorous, but it was honest. She woke before dawn, brewed her own coffee, and walked through the cold morning air to the clinic, where kindness still meant something. Yet every time she changed a bandage or held a patient's hand, her thoughts drifted back to the man she had left behind. The man who had once looked at her as if she was both a mistake and a miracle. One Saturday morning, while organizing medical supplies, she overheard a radio playing in the reception area. The announcer's voice was crisp and familiar. "Tonight, the Harrington Foundation will unveil its newest charitable initiative, a fund dedicated to providing medical care for underserved communities. The event will be hosted by William Harrington himself." Evelyn froze, the roll of gauze slipping from her hands. Medical care, her field, her cause. For a moment, she stood motionless, her heart pounding. Could it be coincidence, or was it something more? That evening, curiosity and something deeper pulled her toward the address printed on the invitation she had once ignored. The building was a grand art hall near Central Park, its windows glowing with golden light. People in elegant attire streamed inside, laughter echoing off marble walls. She stayed near the back, unnoticed among the crowd, until her eyes caught the banner above the stage. Asterisk, the Evelyn Moore Initiative for Community Health. Asterisk, her breath caught, her name. The lights dimmed, and William stepped onto the stage in a dark suit, his presence commanding, yet his eyes seemed softer than she remembered. He spoke into the microphone, his voice steady but full of something that felt like repentance. "When I was given a second chance at life," he began, "I thought success meant reclaiming power. But I learned that power means nothing if it cannot heal. This initiative is dedicated to the woman who reminded me that compassion is not weakness, it is strength." Murmurs filled the room as he continued. "Her kindness changed my life. Tonight, I honor her, not with apology, but with action." The applause thundered through the hall, but Evelyn barely heard it. Her vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. He had not forgotten. After the ceremony, she slipped quietly toward the exit, wanting to leave before anyone noticed. But near the foyer, a familiar voice stopped her. "Leaving so soon, Mrs. Harrington?" She turned. William stood there, hands in his pockets, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You should not be here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And yet here you are," he replied gently. "I had to see if you would come." The silence between them was heavy but tender. "You did not have to name it after me," she said, her eyes glistening. "I did," he answered. "Because every life it touches will carry a part of what you taught me." She shook her head slowly, her voice breaking. "You hurt me, William. You believed the worst of me." His expression darkened with regret. "I know. I was afraid. I spent years controlling everything around me, but when I met you, I could not control what I felt, and that terrified me." His confession hung in the air, raw and sincere. "I am not asking for forgiveness," he said softly. "Only a chance to prove that I can be the man you once believed I could be." Evelyn's heart ached with a mixture of longing and pain. She looked at him for a long time, the crowd behind them fading into nothing. "And what if I say no?" she asked quietly. William's smile was bittersweet. "Then I will still spend the rest of my life building something good in your name?" She took a deep breath, her tears spilling freely now. "You always did have a way of making it impossible to hate you," she whispered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old folded paper, their annulment agreement, edges worn, signatures faded. "I kept this," he said, "not as proof of what we lost, but as a reminder of what we might still find." Then, slowly, he tore it in half. The sound of paper tearing echoed softly through the grand hall. He extended his hand to her. No contracts this time, just truth. Evelyn hesitated only a moment before placing her hand in his. Around them, the music from the ballroom swelled once more, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to smile. Somewhere deep inside, she realized that sometimes love does not arrive by choice or plan, it arrives by mistake and stays by grace. Spring returned to New York with the scent of magnolias drifting through the city air, and for the first time in a long while, the Harrington mansion did not feel cold. The house that once echoed with silence now hummed with life. In the grand foyer, sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating a row of photographs on the console table, images of smiling children at the new medical center, doctors in white coats, and Evelyn standing beside William at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Evelyn Moore Foundation. A new beginning had taken root, not from wealth or power, but from grace. William Harrington had stepped down from his corporate throne and poured his resources into something that outlived profits, a future built on compassion. In his study, once a room of deals and contracts, now lay sketches of new hospitals and community clinics. He sat at his desk writing a letter in his neat, deliberate hand. The top of the page read, "To my wife." His voice echoed softly as he read it aloud to himself. "I spent years thinking love was something to control, a business of gain and loss. But you showed me that love, like healing, begins with surrender." When he finished, he folded the letter carefully and placed it into an envelope marked with her name. That afternoon, Evelyn returned from the clinic, her white coat draped over her arm and a soft smile on her face. The butler greeted her warmly. "Welcome home, Mrs. Harrington." The words still felt strange to her, yet they no longer carried the weight of obligation. She walked through the house, pausing by the parlor where children's drawings donations from the hospital's young patients covered the walls. One sketch caught her eye. Two figures standing under an umbrella, hand in hand, with a caption written in a child's uneven scrawl. "Thank you for saving us." Evelyn pressed a hand to her heart, tears pricking her eyes. When she reached the study, William looked up from his desk, that familiar smile curving at the edges of his lips. "You are early," he said softly. "Patience canceled," she replied, setting her things down. "Apparently, miracles do not run on schedules." He chuckled. "No, but they do seem to find you often." She crossed the room, resting her hands on his shoulders. "And you, mister?" Harrington seemed to have found peace. He covered her hands with his, warm and steady. "Only because you taught me how to stop fighting for control." Evening settled gently over the mansion, painting the world outside in hues of gold and rose. The two of them sat together on the terrace, overlooking the blooming garden. The same roses that once froze in winter now swayed in the breeze, alive again. Evelyn leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "The accident, the mistakes, everything that led us here?" He shook his head. "If I had to fall, I would fall the same way again because it brought me to you." She smiled, her eyes glistening in the fading light. "You always did know how to turn tragedy into poetry." He turned to her, his voice low but certain. "No poetry, just truth." Inside, the clock chimed softly, marking another hour in a life they never expected but somehow had chosen together. On the mantel above the fireplace, framed in gold, hung the torn remains of their old annulment contract, a symbol of what had been broken and then made whole. Below it rested a new document, handwritten by both of them, titled The Harrington Promise. It was not a legal agreement, but a vow. To use their fortune for good, to heal where others had hurt, and to love without condition. Evelyn read it often, not because she needed to remember, but because it reminded her that even the most unexpected stories could end in grace. As night settled, William reached for her hand. The fire crackled, the world outside quieted, and for the first time since fate tied them together with ink and misunderstanding, there was no fear, only peace. Evelyn whispered, her voice soft as a prayer, "Sometimes the wrong signature writes the right story." William smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And this time," he said, "it is one I will never rewrite." The firelight danced across their faces as the camera of memory pulled back, leaving them framed by warmth, forgiveness, and the quiet miracle of love that had turned a mistake into destiny.